Hi, welcome to valuationpodcast.com, a podcast and video series about all things related to business and valuation. My name is Melissa Gragg, and I provide online divorce mediation and valuation services in St. Louis, Missouri. Today, we will discuss expert witness integrity and neutrality in litigation with Zachary Meyers, a CVA and CPA in Winfield, West Virginia. He's testified and been qualified as an expert in the forensic accounting, taxation, business valuation, pension valuation fields specific to civil, marital, and criminal litigation. The whole theory of what you wrote is, how does the unimpeachable integrity and objectivity play into the business valuation, whether you do a calculation, whether you do a conclusion, and then in that litigation setting, like how does that look to you?
Well, I'll say it like this. The whole reason why a valuation generally is given more weight than a calculation is because you've objectively looked at it. You've looked at all three approaches. You basically made the objective inference where you basically eliminated the other one or two approaches, and you've selected an approach and a method or technique that best determines the estimate of value. You come to a conclusion. In a calculation, you don't necessarily look at all of the other approaches. You may just look, like you said, you may just look at one. And when it comes down to objectivity, especially in the courtroom, I mean, you have to be unbiased, you have to be unimpeachably neutral, you have to have integrity. And I mean, if you want to do from a mathematical standpoint, your testimony has to be helpful and more likely than not, which means 51%. And if you only do one approach and you don't even consider the other two, that's 1/3.
Right.
And I think that if you be unbiased, I mean, the definition of bias is if you don't give consideration to some other alternative, either conclusion or outcome or value or something like that, and you don't even give a reason as to why that possible alternative is not the right alternative or not the right approach to value. And it's very important because when it comes to testifying in court, you work for the court. You don't work necessarily. I mean, you can get hired by one side or the other. You can be appointed as a neutral expert. Sometimes there's two experts, and you can get appointed as a third expert if the judge doesn't believe either one of them or doesn't know who to believe. But no matter who hires you, whether it's one party, both parties, the judge, or nobody, you have to be neutral. You have to have integrity. You have to have objectivity. And I think that that's sort of at the heart of, why, generally speaking, evaluation is going to be your best form of report in a litigation setting. You can, like you said, you can do a calculation in a litigation setting, but you got to be very careful. I mean, literally, it's very hard to defend a self-imposed scope limitation that the other expert didn't have, and you just either a client-imposed scope limitation that your client wants you to basically limit yourself to, or you're limiting yourself. And I think you got to be very, very careful. Now, there's instances, especially with COVID-19, where it is most certainly at least an option to do a calculation, especially if all parties can agree to it and the court's made aware of it. And I say that because I've seen, at least in West Virginia is where I do at least half of my cases. Is where I live. Poorest state in the nation. Literally, West Virginia and Mississippi go tit for tat each and every year. They go back and forth, 49-50 for the poorest state. The average median income is like $35,000 a year. And there's a lot of self-employed individuals who have very small businesses, but they still get divorced. And just because their business only makes $500,000 in revenue or $1 million, when they get divorced, they may still have to value that business, at least in West Virginia. And so, because the economy is almost, even before COVID, West Virginia had a bad economy. But even still yet, whenever you have, children involved, and maybe you should, the lawyers need to focus their efforts more on the child support, the custody, and all that stuff. Sometimes in the big scheme of things, the value estimate of a self-employed, very small business, it may not need or require that much work. The judge may see that. The judge, courts are generally always trying to be judicially effective or cost effective. And so anything that you can kind of get everybody to stipulate to, generally courts like that. And especially, divorce is a very costly thing. So anytime somebody gets divorced, you have to basically come to the conclusion that it's going to cost more for us to be divorced and separate and operating as two different households. And, I try to be conscious of that. I mean, I have kids myself. I have stepkids. I live the blended family thing every day of my life. And so I try to be very conscious of, all of those decisions that have to be made during the divorce hearing or final hearing or that whole process. And sometimes the business valuation is not the biggest deal that you need to deal with. Sometimes, there's other issues, personal issues. Sometimes you have other issues, especially in West Virginia. You may have substance abuse issues. You may have custodial issues. Those end up taking precedence. So in cases like that, especially when it's going to cost the marital estate maybe more money than it really should, I mean, I first and foremost usually suggest the joint retention of just one expert as opposed to two dueling experts. And I usually do that even when one side approaches me. I'll usually say, hey, before you even give me all the details, why don't you go to the other side and see if they would be interested in a joint expert or a neutral expert sort of position. And those sort of opportunities can sometimes facilitate a calculation as being a better alternative. At least that's in my experience.